Hi there, I'm Cassandra. My brother once told me my dead-end job was an embarrassment to our family name, so he cut me out of every family gathering, blocked me on social media, and told everyone I was a failure who couldn't amount to anything. But then his new boss at Meridian Holdings stepped into our family reunion and introduced me as the chairman of the board, the woman who'd been quietly running a multi-billion-dollar empire while he mocked my worthless career. What happened next showed him what true success really means. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Before we dive into this story that changed everything, tell me where you're tuning in from in the comments below. And if this hits close to home, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow I've got something even more incredible saved just for you. I remember the exact moment my brother decided I was worthless. It wasn't when I missed his college graduation because of a work emergency, or when I couldn't make it to his wedding because I was traveling for my little job. It was a crisp October evening in Millbrook Heights, at our parents' 40th anniversary party, when he stood up in front of 60 of our closest family friends and delivered what he thought was a toast, but turned out to be a public execution of my character. To Mom and Dad, Jeremy raised his champagne glass, his voice carrying across the decorated backyard of our childhood home, who taught us that hard work and ambition matter. Unlike some people in this family, his eyes found mine across the crowd, who are content to waste their Stanford MBA on being a glorified secretary. The silence that followed was deafening. 60 pairs of eyes turned to stare at me. Sitting alone at the back table where I'd been quietly enjoying my mother's famous lasagna, I felt heat rise to my cheeks, not from embarrassment but from the sheer audacity of my brother's public humiliation. He didn't know. None of them knew what I actually did for a living. They'd never asked, never shown interest, never bothered to understand why I traveled constantly, why I carried multiple phones, why I lived in a penthouse apartment in downtown Riverdale that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Jeremy continued his speech, emboldened by what he perceived as my silence of shame rather than my silence of disbelief. Some of us, he gestured to himself and our cousin Patricia, both successful lawyers at prestigious firms, chose to make something of ourselves. We chose careers that matter, that make a difference, that our parents can brag about at their country club. He took a sip of champagne, savoring his moment of superiority. Others chose to be, well, let's just say not everyone can handle the pressure of real success. Our mother, Diane, looked mortified, her perfectly applied makeup unable to hide the flush of embarrassment creeping up her neck. Our father, Robert, stared into his wine glass as if it contained answers to questions he'd never thought to ask. Neither of them defended me. Neither of them questioned Jeremy's assessment. They simply sat there, accepting his version of my failure as fact. That was the night I realized my family had written a story about my life without ever asking me to contribute a single chapter. They'd decided that my quiet nature meant I had nothing to be proud of. They'd assumed that my reluctance to discuss work meant there wasn't much work to discuss. They'd concluded that my modest behavior equaled modest achievements. What they didn't know, what Jeremy didn't know as he stood there basking in his moment of superiority, was that 3 months earlier, I'd been appointed chairman of the board of Thornfield Industries, the parent company that owned dozens of subsidiaries across 7 countries. They didn't know that my little trips were to board meetings in Tokyo, merger negotiations in London, and acquisition discussions in Dubai. They didn't know that my glorified secretary position involved overseeing a workforce of 47,000 employees and managing assets worth $12.8 billion. They didn't know because I'd never told them, not out of secrecy, but because they'd never asked, not because I was ashamed, but because I valued privacy. Not because my work wasn't important, but because I'd learned early in my career that true power often moves quietly, behind the scenes, without fanfare or public recognition. Jeremy finished his speech to polite applause, the kind of clapping you hear at events where people aren't sure if they should be celebrating or calling security. He walked over to my table with a satisfied smirk, clearly expecting me to either defend myself or slink away in shame. "You know, Cass," he said, using the childhood nickname that now sounded condescending rather than affectionate, "it's not too late to make something of yourself. Patricia's firm is always looking for paralegals. I could put in a good word." I looked up at him, this man who shared my DNA but understood nothing about my character, and made a decision that would change everything. "Thanks for the offer, Jeremy," I said, my voice calm and steady, "but I think I'm doing just fine where I am." He laughed, actually laughed, as if my contentment was the punchline to a joke only he understood. "Sure you are, Cass, sure you are." What Jeremy didn't know, as he walked away from that table with his chest puffed out in misplaced pride, was that his career was about to intersect with mine in a way that would redefine everything he thought he knew about success, family, and the quiet power of underestimation. 6 months later, Jeremy would accept a position as Senior Vice President of Corporate Development at Meridian Holdings, convinced he'd finally landed the big break that would cement his status as the family success story. He'd spend weeks preparing for his first board meeting, practicing his presentation, researching the company's leadership structure, desperate to make a perfect impression on the executives who would determine his future. He had no idea that the woman he'd publicly humiliated, the sister he'd dismissed as a failure, the family member he'd written off as worthless, would be sitting at the head of that boardroom table, waiting to show him what real power looked like. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, let me tell you how I got there, and how one brother's arrogance set in motion a series of events that would give new meaning to the phrase, "Never judge a book by its cover." Because sometimes, the people you underestimate are the ones holding all the cards. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Growing up in the affluent suburb of Millbrook Heights, success was measured in very specific ways. Your house had to be visible from the main road, your car had to be less than 2 years old, and your career had to be something our parents could brag about at the Millbrook Country Club's monthly mixer. Jeremy understood this equation perfectly. I never did. We were raised by Robert and Diane Whitmore, two people who genuinely loved their children but had very narrow definitions of achievement. Dad was a retired bank president who still wore three-piece suits to grocery shopping, believing that appearance was half the battle in life. Mom was a former debutante who'd married well and spent 30 years perfecting the art of gracious entertaining and strategic name-dropping. Jeremy, 3 years younger than me, had absorbed their values like a sponge. Even as a kid, he was always performing. Student council president in middle school, valedictorian in high school, Harvard Law School with honors. He collected achievements like trophies, displaying each one prominently for maximum impact. When he landed his first job at Sterling and Associates, one of Boston's most prestigious law firms, Dad literally framed the announcement from the legal journal and hung it in the living room. I was different. Not rebellious exactly, but quieter. I'd won the state debate championship in high school, but I'd never mentioned it at dinner. I'd graduated summa cum laude from Stanford with my MBA, but I hadn't sent announcements or thrown a party. When I'd started my career at a small consulting firm in Riverdale, I'd simply packed my things, found an apartment, and began working. "Cassandra's always been our mysterious one," Mom would tell her friends, with a laugh that contained just a hint of concern. "We never quite know what she's up to." It wasn't mystery, though. It was just that my definition of success didn't require an audience. At family gatherings, Jeremy would hold court, regaling everyone with stories of his latest high-profile case, the famous clients he was representing, the million-dollar settlements he'd negotiated. "Just closed a deal for Pinnacle Pharmaceuticals," he'd announce over Sunday dinner. "Biggest merger in their company history. The partners were so impressed, they're fast-tracking me for junior partner." When relatives asked about my work, I'd give simple answers. "Oh, I'm in business consulting. Nothing too exciting. I help companies with strategic planning." It was technically true, just not complete. I didn't mention that my strategic planning involved restructuring multinational corporations, that my consulting meant sitting on boards of directors, that my clients included Fortune 500 companies and international conglomerates. My parents' friends would nod politely when I spoke, the way adults respond to children's drawings, acknowledging the effort while clearly not impressed by the result. Then Jeremy would jump in with another story about his legal victories, and the room's energy would shift back to genuine interest and admiration. The family dynamic was established early and never questioned. Jeremy was the golden child, the one whose achievements reflected well on the family name. I was the steady, reliable daughter who'd probably end up married to a nice accountant and living in a modest colonial house with a white picket fence. Not unsuccessful exactly, but not remarkable either. Our cousin Patricia reinforced this narrative whenever she visited from New York. She was a corporate lawyer at Blackstone and Partners, specializing in entertainment law, and she loved to share stories about the celebrities she'd met, the movie premieres she'd attended, the glamorous life she lived representing actors and musicians. "It's so rewarding," she'd say, "knowing that my work directly impacts people's careers, their dreams." The three of them, Jeremy, Patricia, and their endless stream of achievement-focused conversation, made family gatherings feel like professional networking events where I was the only person without an impressive business card to exchange. I'd sit quietly, eating Mom's famous pot roast, listening to them discuss their careers with the kind of passion and detail that suggested they truly believed their work defined their worth as human beings. What they didn't understand was that I'd deliberately chosen a different path. I'd learned early in my career that the most powerful people are often the ones you've never heard of, the decision makers who prefer boardrooms to press conferences, who value influence over recognition. I'd built my reputation on discretion, competence, and results rather than publicity, acclaim, and self-promotion. My apartment in downtown Riverdale was beautiful but understated. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor, original hardwood floors, a kitchen that rarely got used because I traveled so much for work. I drove a reliable sedan, not because I couldn't afford something flashier, but because I preferred vehicles that didn't attract attention. I dressed professionally but conservatively, understanding that in many business contexts, being underestimated was an advantage. My days were full of phone conferences with executives in different time zones, strategy meetings that determined the futures of thousands of employees, decisions that would impact entire industries. But when family members asked how my week was going, I'd just say, "Oh, the usual. A few meetings, some travel." The irony was that I genuinely loved my family, despite their inability to see me clearly. I loved Jeremy's enthusiasm, even when it was misplaced. I loved my parents' pride in their children, even when it was unevenly distributed. I loved our family traditions, the Sunday dinners, the holiday celebrations, the annual vacation to Cape Cod, where we'd all pretend that our relationships were simpler than they actually were. I'd watch Jeremy receive standing ovations for his latest professional triumph, and I'd clap along, genuinely happy for his success. I'd listen to my parents beam with pride as they described his accomplishments to their friends, and I'd smile, understanding that their joy was real and valid. I'd participate in family photos where Jeremy stood in the center, clearly the star of the show, and I'd position myself quietly to one side, content to be part of the constellation rather than the sun. But there was always an undercurrent of something else. A sense that my place in the family was conditional, dependent on my willingness to accept the role they'd assigned me. As long as I remained quiet, modest, unremarkable, I belonged. As long as I didn't challenge their narrative about who was successful and who was just getting by, I was welcome. What would happen, I sometimes wondered, if they knew the truth? If they understood that their underachieving daughter was actually operating at levels of success they couldn't even imagine? If they realized that the family member they'd written off as ordinary was extraordinary in ways they'd never bothered to discover? I was about to find out, because Jeremy's ambition was about to lead him directly into my world, and our family's carefully constructed hierarchy was about to be turned completely upside down. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March, while I was reviewing quarterly reports for our Southeast Asian operations. My assistant, Rachel, knocked on my office door with an unusual expression on her face, part confusion, part amusement. "Ms. Whitmore, your brother is on line 3. He says it's urgent, and he needs to speak with you about a life-changing opportunity." She paused, clearly trying to maintain professional composure. He also mentioned something about finally being able to help the family's reputation. I almost smiled. Jeremy had never called me at work before, mainly because he'd never bothered to learn where I worked or what my phone number was. The fact that he'd somehow tracked down the main switchboard at Thornfield Industries and convinced someone to transfer him to the chairman's office was actually impressive, in a misguided sort of way. "Put him through," I said, closing the acquisition file I'd been reading and preparing myself for whatever Jeremy considered a, quote, life-changing opportunity. "Cass!" His voice practically exploded through the phone, filled with an excitement I hadn't heard since he'd gotten into Harvard Law. "You're not going to believe this. I mean, you literally will not believe what just happened to me." I leaned back in my leather chair, looking out at the Riverdale skyline through my floor-to-ceiling windows. "I'm listening." "I just got offered the position of Senior Vice President of Corporate Development at Meridian Holdings." The words tumbled out of him in a rush. "Do you know what this means, Cass? Do you understand how huge this is?" Meridian Holdings. One of our newest subsidiaries. A company we'd acquired 18 months ago specifically for their innovative approach to renewable energy infrastructure. I'd personally overseen the integration process, working closely with their executive team to ensure a smooth transition under the Thornfield umbrella. Their current CEO, David Richardson, had been handpicked by our board, well, by me, to lead the expansion into sustainable technologies. "Congratulations," I said carefully. "That sounds like a wonderful opportunity." "Wonderful?" Jeremy laughed, a sound filled with disbelief at my understatement. "Cass, this is the break I've been working toward my entire career. Meridian Holdings isn't just any company. They're part of Thornfield Industries, one of the most powerful conglomerates in the world. I'll be reporting directly to the board of directors." The irony was so perfect it was almost painful. My brother, who'd spent years dismissing my career as insignificant, was now ecstatic about joining a company I owned. He was thrilled to report to a board I chaired. He was celebrating an opportunity to work for the woman he'd publicly humiliated 6 months earlier. "The salary," he continued, his voice dropping to an awed whisper, "Cass, they offered me more money than I make in 2 years at Sterling & Associates. Plus stock options, plus a signing bonus that's more than most people make in their lifetime. I'm going to be rich, Cass, actually legitimately wealthy." I found myself wondering what Jeremy would consider legitimately wealthy. The signing bonus he was so excited about probably represented less than a day's interest on my personal investment portfolio, but his enthusiasm was genuine, and, despite everything, I felt a small surge of pride in my little brother's achievement. "When do you start?" I asked. "Next month! Can you believe it? 1 month from now, I'll be walking into the Meridian building as a senior vice president." He paused, and I could practically hear him grinning through the phone. "You know what this means, right? This changes everything for our family. Finally, the Whitmore name is going to mean something in business circles that matter." The dismissiveness in his tone, the implication that our family name had been somehow lacking before his arrival at Meridian, should have stung. Instead, it struck me as deeply sad. Jeremy had spent so much time chasing external validation, that he'd completely missed the fact that the Whitmore name already meant something in business circles. It meant something because of me. "Mom and Dad are going to be so proud," he continued. "I mean, they're already proud, but this is the kind of success they've always dreamed of for their children, the kind of career that actually matters." The phrase hung in the air between us. The kind of career that actually matters. The implicit message was clear. My career, whatever Jeremy imagined it to be, didn't matter. It wasn't real success. It wasn't something our parents could brag about at the country club. "I'm planning to tell them this weekend," Jeremy said. "I'm driving down to Millbrook Heights on Saturday for Mom's birthday dinner. You should come, Cass. I mean, you should definitely be there when I share the news. It'll be good for you to see what's possible when you really apply yourself, you know?" The condescension in his voice was so casual, so automatic, that I wondered if he even heard it himself. In Jeremy's mind, his new position at a company I owned was proof of his superior work ethic and ambition. My actual ownership of that company was invisible to him because it didn't fit the narrative he'd constructed about our respective places in the world. "I'll try to make it," I said, knowing that I definitely would be there. This weekend's dinner was going to be more interesting than Jeremy could possibly imagine. "You should, Cass, really. Maybe being around this kind of success will inspire you to think bigger about your own career. I mean, I know you're comfortable where you are, but there's so much more out there if you're willing to reach for it." After we hung up, I sat in my office for a long time, processing the conversation and what it revealed about my family's perception of me. Jeremy wasn't trying to be cruel. He genuinely believed he was being encouraging, maybe even generous, by suggesting that his success might inspire me to improve my own situation. He had no idea that his life-changing opportunity existed because I'd created it. He didn't know that Meridian Holdings was thriving because I'd invested millions in their technology and infrastructure. He couldn't fathom that his new boss, David Richardson, had been briefed about my personal interest in Jeremy's career development and instructed to give him every opportunity to succeed. I'd been quietly watching Jeremy's career for years, not because I thought he needed my help, but because I loved him despite his blind spots. When I'd learned through industry contacts that he was looking to transition from law to corporate development, I'd made sure Meridian's HR department received his resume. When they'd expressed interest in interviewing him, I'd asked David to evaluate Jeremy purely on his merits, not on family connections. Jeremy had earned the position legitimately. His credentials were solid, his interview performance had been excellent, and his strategic thinking impressed the hiring committee. But he'd never have gotten the interview without my behind-the-scenes influence, something he would never know and probably wouldn't appreciate if he did. The weekend of Mom's birthday dinner was going to be fascinating. Jeremy would announce his triumph to a family gathering, expecting congratulations and admiration for reaching the pinnacle of professional success. Our parents would beam with pride, finally having the kind of son-in-law achievement they could showcase to their country club friends. Patricia would probably chime in with her own career updates, not wanting to be overshadowed by Jeremy's corporate coup. And I would sit there quietly, as always, listening to them celebrate my brother's good fortune in joining a company where I was the ultimate decision-maker. I would watch him bask in the glory of a career move that positioned him several levels below me in the same corporate hierarchy. I would smile and nod and offer appropriate congratulations while internally marveling at the strange ways life arranges its ironies. The question was, how long could this continue? How long could I maintain the illusion that my career was insignificant while Jeremy built his dreams on the foundation of my actual achievements? And more importantly, what would happen when the truth inevitably came out? Because it would come out. Eventually, Jeremy would attend his first board meeting at Meridian Holdings. Eventually, he would sit in a conference room and learn exactly who was really in charge of his new corporate home. Eventually, the sister he'd dismissed as a failure would be revealed as the woman who controlled his professional destiny. When that moment came, everything would change. The family dynamics we'd maintained for decades would shatter. The assumptions that had defined our relationships would crumble. And Jeremy would have to confront the reality that success isn't always loud, power isn't always obvious, and the people you underestimate might be the ones holding all the cards. I was looking forward to it. Mom's 58th birthday dinner became the launching pad for what I can only describe as Jeremy's complete transformation from annoying little brother to insufferable corporate prince. The moment he walked into our parents' dining room that Saturday evening, everything about him radiated newfound confidence and barely contained superiority. He'd bought a new suit for the occasion, Italian wool, perfectly tailored, probably costing more than most people's monthly rent. His haircut was fresh from some upscale salon in Boston, his shoes were polished to mirror brightness, and he carried himself with the swagger of someone who'd just been handed the keys to the kingdom. "Mom, Dad," he announced before we'd even finished our appetizers, "I have some news that's going to change everything for this family." The theatrical pause that followed was quintessentially Jeremy. He looked around the table, making sure he had everyone's full attention. Mom with her expectant smile, Dad already reaching for his phone to record what was clearly going to be a momentous announcement, Patricia leaning forward with interest, and me sitting quietly at the far end of the table, already knowing exactly what was coming. "I've accepted a position as Senior Vice President of Corporate Development at Meridian Holdings," he said, his voice carrying the gravity of someone announcing a royal decree. "Effective April 1st, I will be one of the youngest SVPs in the history of Thornfield Industries, subsidiary companies." The reaction was everything Jeremy had hoped for and more. Mom actually gasped, her hand flying to her chest in that dramatic way she'd perfected over decades of social events. Dad stood up from his chair and started clapping, his face beaming with pride. Patricia squealed, actually squealed, and immediately started asking questions about salary ranges and stock options. "Jeremy, sweetheart," Mom exclaimed, tears already forming in her eyes. "This is incredible. I can't believe. I mean, Thornfield Industries, that's one of the biggest companies in the world." "One of the most powerful," Dad corrected, still clapping. "Son, do you realize what this means? The connections you'll make, the opportunities that will open up, the prestige." He trailed off, apparently overwhelmed by the magnitude of Jeremy's achievement. For the next hour, our family dinner transformed into what could only be described as the Jeremy Whitmore success celebration. Every conversation topic somehow circled back to his new position. Every family story was reframed through the lens of how it had prepared him for this moment of triumph. Every future plan was discussed in terms of how Jeremy's corporate influence might benefit various family members. "We'll finally be able to hold our heads up at the country club," Mom said, reaching over to squeeze Jeremy's hand. "I mean, really hold them up. When people ask what our children do for a living, I'll be able to say, Senior Vice President at Thornfield Industries, and watch their faces light up with respect." The phrase stung more than I'd expected. The implication was clear. Before Jeremy's appointment, our parents hadn't been able to hold their heads up because of me. My career, whatever they imagined it to be, had been a source of embarrassment rather than pride. Patricia chimed in with her own excitement. "Jeremy, this is going to be amazing for networking. I have clients who would kill for connections at Thornfield. Maybe we can help each other out professionally." "Absolutely," Jeremy nodded magnanimously. "I'm going to be in a position to help a lot of people now. It's actually part of why I'm so excited about this opportunity. The chance to lift up the people I care about." His gaze swept around the table, lingering on each family member with benevolent generosity, until his eyes reached me. The look he gave me was different, pitying, almost sympathetic, as if my presence at this celebration was both touching and slightly tragic. In fact, he continued, his tone shifting to something that might have been kindness if it hadn't been so condescending, "Cass, I want you to know that this changes things for you too. I'll be able to make introductions, maybe help you find something more substantial, something worthy of your education and potential." The table went quiet for a moment, everyone processing Jeremy's generous offer to rescue his underachieving sister from her professional mediocrity. I could feel their eyes on me, waiting for my reaction to this unexpected gift of Jeremy's corporate charity. "That's very thoughtful," I said carefully, cutting a piece of Mom's chocolate cake with deliberate precision. "I appreciate the offer." Jeremy's smile widened, clearly pleased with what he interpreted as my gratitude. "I mean it, Cass. I know things have been challenging for you career-wise. But having a brother at my level of the corporate world opens doors. I can put in a good word with the right people, maybe get you interviews at companies that matter." Companies that matter. The phrase echoed the dismissive language he'd used about my work for years, but now it carried the additional weight of his newfound authority. Jeremy wasn't just dismissing my career anymore, he was offering to save me from it. Dad jumped back into the conversation, clearly energized by the possibility of both his children achieving what he considered real success. "This is wonderful, Jeremy. You know, I've always said that family should help family. If you can use your position to help Cassandra find something more appropriate to her abilities, well, that would be the icing on the cake." More appropriate to her abilities. I set down my fork and looked at my father, this man who'd raised me, who'd paid for my education, who'd celebrated my college graduation, and who apparently had no idea what my abilities actually were. "What kind of position do you think would be appropriate for me, Dad?" I asked, genuinely curious about his assessment. He considered the question seriously, clearly wanting to be encouraging while remaining realistic about my prospects. "Well, with your MBA, you're certainly qualified for management positions, maybe something in human resources or marketing for a smaller company. Something stable, respectable, where you could use your education without too much pressure." The casual dismissal was breathtaking. My father, in his genuine desire to be supportive, had just suggested that I might be qualified for middle management at a small company, while celebrating his son's appointment to a position that was, in reality, 3 levels below mine in the corporate hierarchy. Jeremy nodded thoughtfully at Dad's suggestion. "That's exactly what I was thinking. Something stable, without too much stress. I mean, not everyone is cut out for high-stakes corporate decision-making. There's nothing wrong with finding your level and being content there." Finding your level. The phrase hung in the air like incense at a funeral, ceremonial, suffocating, and marking the end of something that could never be brought back to life. Over the following weeks, Jeremy's transformation accelerated. His phone calls became more frequent, but less personal, filled with casual mentions of board meetings he was preparing for, strategy sessions with C-suite executives, and business trips to cities I'd visited countless times as part of my actual job responsibilities. "I'm flying to Singapore next week for a merger discussion," he told me during one of his regular check-in calls. "Can you believe it? 6 months ago, I was stuck in Boston writing contracts, and now I'm participating in international business deals that will affect thousands of jobs." Singapore. I'd been there just 2 months earlier, finalizing the acquisition of a manufacturing consortium that would become part of Meridian's supply chain expansion. I'd personally approved the merger Jeremy was now so excited to attend as a junior participant. The family group text that Mom had created to share Jeremy's professional updates became a constant source of surreal entertainment. Photos of him in business class en route to meetings I'd arranged. Screenshots of his Outlook calendar showing appointments with executives who reported to me. Updates about his new office with a view of the Riverdale Financial District, located 12 floors below the penthouse suite where I spent most of my working hours. Jeremy's doing so well. Mom texted the group one Thursday afternoon, along with a photo he'd sent of himself standing in front of the Meridian Holdings logo in the building lobby. He says the board of directors has been very impressed with his strategic thinking. They're already talking about fast-tracking him for additional responsibilities. The board of directors. The same board where I sat at the head of the table, where my voice carried more weight than all the other members combined, where decisions about fast-tracking employees like Jeremy required my explicit approval. But perhaps the most telling change was in how Jeremy talked about our family's future. His success at Meridian hadn't just elevated his own status. It had somehow rewritten the entire narrative of our family's worth and potential. "I've been thinking," he said during a Sunday dinner at our parents' house, "maybe it's time we considered joining Hillcrest Country Club instead of Millbrook. The membership fees are higher, but the networking opportunities are incredible. Plus, it would put us in the right social circles for my career trajectory." Our parents nodded enthusiastically, clearly thrilled at the prospect of upgrading their social status to match Jeremy's professional advancement. The conversation that followed was all about prestige, connections, and the kind of people who mattered in business and society. I sat quietly, listening to my family plan their social elevation based on Jeremy's appointment to a company I controlled, and realized that something fundamental had shifted. It wasn't just that they'd misunderstood my career. It was that Jeremy's success had made my perceived failure even more stark in their eyes. He was ascending to heights they'd always dreamed of for their children. I remained, in their understanding, exactly where I'd always been: steady, reliable, unremarkable, and increasingly irrelevant to the family's bright new future. The stage was being set for a revelation that would shatter everything they thought they knew about success, power, and which of their children had actually made something of themselves. By May, I had effectively become a ghost at my own family gatherings, not literally absent. I still showed up, still participated in the rituals of family connection, but emotionally and socially invisible in ways that would have been heartbreaking if they hadn't been so absurdly ironic. Jeremy's first month at Meridian Holdings had transformed him into the family's singular focus. Every conversation revolved around his experiences, his insights, his rapidly expanding influence in what they believed to be the pinnacle of corporate America. I would sit at the dinner table, listening to him describe board meetings I had chaired, strategic initiatives I had approved, company policies I had personally drafted, while our parents hung on his every word, as if he were delivering revelations from the business world's highest echelons. "The board is incredibly sophisticated," Jeremy explained during one particularly surreal Sunday dinner, cutting his steak with the precision of someone who'd recently discovered fine dining. "These are people who think in terms of global markets, international implications, long-term strategic positioning. It's humbling, honestly, to be in rooms with minds that operate at that level." I almost choked on my wine. Jeremy was describing me. Specifically, he was describing my approach to corporate strategy, while simultaneously dismissing me as someone who couldn't possibly understand such sophisticated thinking. The cognitive dissonance was so profound it had become almost entertaining. "Tell them about the acquisition discussions," Mom prompted, her eyes bright with vicarious excitement. She'd started keeping a notebook where she wrote down Jeremy's professional updates, apparently so she could accurately retell his achievements to her friends at the garden club. "Well, I probably shouldn't go into too much detail," Jeremy said with the conspiratorial air of someone privy to state secrets, "but we're looking at expanding into renewable energy infrastructure across Southeast Asia. The chairman has very specific visions for sustainable technology integration, and I've been asked to help develop the implementation timeline." The chairman, me, Jeremy, was being asked to help develop implementation timelines for my visions, my strategic priorities, my personal commitment to environmental sustainability that I'd been pursuing for 3 years before Meridian Holdings even existed. But in his telling, these were sophisticated concepts he was helping to shape rather than directives he was being paid to execute. Dad leaned forward with the intensity of someone receiving inside information about the stock market. "How closely do you work with the chairman?" I mean, someone at your level must have regular contact with the top tier of leadership. Jeremy's smile was modest but pleased. More than you might expect, actually. The chairman specifically requested that all senior VPs have direct reporting relationships rather than going through multiple management layers. It's unusual, but it speaks to the kind of forward-thinking leadership that makes Thornfield Industries so successful. Forward-thinking leadership. I had implemented the direct reporting structure specifically because I valued hearing from middle management without the filtering effect of bureaucratic layers. Jeremy was benefiting from my management philosophy while crediting it to my forward-thinking leadership, apparently unaware that he was describing my decision-making to my own family. Patricia, who had driven down from New York for the weekend, was taking notes on her phone. "Jeremy, I have to ask, do you think there might be opportunities for other family members? I mean, a company like Thornfield probably needs legal counsel for various subsidiaries." "Actually," Jeremy said, warming to the topic, "there might be. I could put in a good word, maybe arrange some introductions. The legal department is massive, and they're always looking for qualified corporate attorneys." I watched Patricia's face light up at the possibility of joining the legal team that already included 3 firms I'd personally vetted and approved. Jeremy was offering to help his cousin get hired by lawyers who ultimately answered to me, using influence he thought he possessed, but which actually flowed from decisions I made in boardrooms he'd never seen. The conversation continued in this vein for nearly 2 hours, my family discussing opportunities within my company, analyzing my business strategies as if they were revolutionary concepts developed by someone else, and celebrating Jeremy's proximity to power that was, in reality, proximity to me. When they turned their attention to me, which happened less and less frequently as Jeremy's star continued to rise, the contrast was stark and painful. "How are things going with your work, Cassie?" Dad asked during a brief lull in the Jeremy appreciation session. The question felt obligatory, a polite gesture toward inclusion rather than genuine interest. "Oh, you know, the usual. Some interesting projects, a few challenging clients." "That's nice, dear," Mom said absently, already turning back toward Jeremy. "Honey, tell your father about the sustainability initiative you mentioned. He's been very interested in green energy investments lately." The sustainability initiative. The one I'd conceived, budgeted, and personally championed through 18 months of board meetings and stakeholder negotiations. The one Jeremy was now presenting as evidence of his strategic thinking and environmental consciousness. But the moment that truly crystallized my new status in the family hierarchy came during Patricia's birthday celebration in late May. We were gathered at an upscale restaurant in downtown Boston, the kind of place where Jeremy now felt comfortable ordering wine by vintage year and discussing market trends with the sommelier. The conversation had naturally gravitated toward career updates and professional achievements. Patricia shared news about a high-profile case she was handling for a celebrity client. Dad talked about his volunteer work on the hospital foundation board. Mom described the charity fundraiser she was organizing for the local arts council. When they reached me, there was a brief, awkward pause. Not because they'd forgotten I was there, but because my career had become such a non-entity in their minds that they genuinely couldn't think of anything to ask. "Cassandra's been very busy with her consulting work," Jeremy finally said, his tone carrying the charitable kindness of someone helping a struggling relative save face. "Haven't you, Cass?" "Yes," I said simply. "Very busy." "It's wonderful that you've found something you enjoy," Mom added with bright encouragement. "Not everyone needs to work at Jeremy's level to be happy and fulfilled." Jeremy's level? The phrase had become a unit of measurement in our family, a standard against which all professional achievement was now evaluated. Anything below Jeremy's level was acceptable for people with modest ambitions, but it wasn't the kind of success that warranted detailed discussion or genuine pride. The final blow came when the waiter brought the check. Dad reached for his wallet, but Jeremy smoothly intercepted. "Please, let me get this," he said with the easy confidence of someone whose signing bonus exceeded most people's annual salaries. "It's the least I can do for my family." The gesture was generous and well-intentioned, but the message was clear. Jeremy had ascended to the role of family provider, the successful son who could afford to treat his parents and cousins to expensive dinners. I had been relegated to the position of grateful recipient, someone whose financial situation presumably required Jeremy's largesse. As we left the restaurant, I walked several steps behind the group, listening to them make plans for a weekend trip to Martha's Vineyard that Jeremy wanted to fund as a gift for our parents' upcoming anniversary. They discussed logistics, restaurant reservations, and activities with the excited energy of people whose dreams were being made possible by Jeremy's corporate success. Nobody asked if I could join them, not because they didn't want me there, but because they assumed I couldn't afford to take time off from my little consulting job or contribute to the expenses of a luxury vacation. I had become the family member who needed to be accommodated rather than included as an equal participant. That night, I sat in my penthouse apartment overlooking the Riverdale Harbor, reviewing financial reports from companies Jeremy had never heard of, making decisions that would affect the livelihoods of thousands of employees across multiple continents, and marveling at the completeness of my transformation from family success story to family charity case. My phone buzzed with messages from the family group chat. Jeremy had posted photos from dinner, including one where I appeared in the background, slightly out of focus, while he posed confidently at the center of the frame. The comments from various aunts and uncles were predictable. "So proud of Jeremy. What an achievement. The Whitmore family is really making its mark." I scrolled through the congratulations, the emoji-filled responses, the excited questions about Jeremy's future prospects, and realized that I had achieved something I'd never intended: complete invisibility within my own family structure. They no longer saw me as unsuccessful. That would have required them to see me at all. I had become background noise in the symphony of Jeremy's achievements, a minor character in the story of his corporate ascension, a person whose presence was pleasant, but whose absence would barely be noticed. The irony was so complete it was almost beautiful. I had spent years building an empire so quietly and carefully that even my own family couldn't see it. Now that empire was providing the foundation for Jeremy's success, funding his dreams, and enabling his transformation into the family hero, while I faded into irrelevance. But invisibility, I was beginning to realize, could also be power, and Jeremy's first board meeting was only 3 weeks away. The call came at 6:47 a.m. on a Wednesday morning in early June. My private line, the one only 3 people in the world had access to, was ringing insistently as I reviewed reports from our Tokyo office. The caller ID showed David Richardson, CEO of Meridian Holdings, and something in my chest tightened. David never called this early unless something significant was happening. "Cassandra," his voice carried an unusual tension, "we need to talk, it's about your brother." I set down my coffee and gave him my full attention. "What's happened?" "Nothing catastrophic," David said quickly, "but we have a situation developing that I thought you should be aware of before it becomes complicated." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Jeremy has been making some assumptions about his role here that are starting to affect team dynamics." Over the next 20 minutes, David painted a picture that was both predictable and concerning. Jeremy had arrived at Meridian Holdings convinced that his rapid hiring and direct reporting relationship to the board meant he was being groomed for executive leadership. He'd started making decisions that exceeded his authority, promising clients outcomes he couldn't deliver, and most problematically, referring to conversations with the chairman that had never actually occurred. Yesterday, he told a potential acquisition target that he had direct input on our strategic direction because he works closely with executive leadership, David explained. When they asked for specifics about his relationship with the chairman, he implied that you and he have regular one-on-one meetings to discuss company vision. The absurdity of it was stunning. Jeremy had transformed our non-existent professional relationship into evidence of his influence within my own company. He was using his imaginary access to me as leverage in business negotiations, apparently unaware that his fictional conversations with the chairman were being reported directly to the chairman herself. "There's more," David continued. "He's been telling other VPs that he expects to be included in the next board meeting as an observer, based on his special relationship with senior leadership. Some of the team are starting to wonder if there are nepotism issues they should be aware of." Nepotism issues. Jeremy's colleagues were beginning to suspect he had family connections that explained his confident behavior and assumed privileges. They were absolutely right, of course, but not in the way they imagined. "How are you handling it?" I asked. "Very carefully," David said. "I don't want to embarrass him or create a situation that becomes personally awkward for you. But I also can't let him continue operating under these assumptions. It's affecting his performance and the team's confidence in our management structure." I found myself in a peculiar position. As chairman of the board, I could have David handle this situation any number of ways. I could have Jeremy quietly reassigned to a role with less client interaction. I could have him transferred to a different subsidiary where his misconceptions couldn't cause problems. I could even have him terminated for misrepresenting his authority to external partners. But as his sister who had been dismissed, ignored, and rendered invisible by his success, I felt something more complex. Not revenge, exactly, but a growing recognition that this situation was approaching a natural conclusion that would resolve itself more elegantly than any intervention I could design. "What does Jeremy's calendar look like for the next few weeks?" I asked. David's tone shifted slightly, recognizing that we were moving into strategic planning mode. "He's got several client meetings scheduled, a presentation to the renewable energy team, and," he paused, "he's been asking about the July board meeting. Specifically, he's been requesting permission to attend as an observer." The July board meeting, our quarterly review session, where we discussed performance metrics, strategic adjustments, and long-term planning across all subsidiaries. The meeting where Jeremy would finally come face-to-face with the reality of who actually ran the company he'd been pretending to influence. "Schedule him to present at the board meeting," I said, surprising David with the directive. "Have him prepare a comprehensive report on the renewable energy initiatives he's been working on. Give him 30 minutes to present his analysis and recommendations to the full board." "Cassandra," David's voice carried a note of concern, "are you sure that's wise? If he's been overstating his role and influence, putting him in front of the board could be embarrassing for everyone involved." "Trust me," I said, feeling a clarity I hadn't experienced in months. "This is exactly what needs to happen. Jeremy has been telling everyone about his close working relationship with the chairman and his influence on company strategy. Let's give him the opportunity to demonstrate that relationship in person." After we hung up, I sat in my office considering the elegant simplicity of what was about to unfold. Jeremy had created a fictional narrative about his importance within my company. Now he would have the chance to present that narrative directly to me, in front of the people who actually understood the corporate hierarchy, while believing he was impressing strangers who might promote him based on his performance. But David's call had revealed something else, something that made me realize I wasn't just observing this situation anymore. I was actively participating in its resolution. For months, I had been the passive recipient of my family's dismissal, accepting their narrative about my insignificance, while Jeremy built his dreams on the foundation of my actual achievements. Now, for the first time, I had the opportunity to be an active participant in determining how this story would end. The irony was that Jeremy himself had created this opportunity. His overconfidence, his assumptions about his importance, his willingness to misrepresent his role to clients and colleagues, all of it was leading directly to the moment when his fictional relationship with the chairman would be tested in the most public way possible. I picked up my phone and called my assistant. "Rachel, I need you to do something for me. Contact Jeremy Whitmore at Meridian Holdings and let him know that the board has reviewed his request to observe our July meeting. Tell him we've decided to give him an even better opportunity. 30 minutes to present his strategic analysis of our renewable energy initiatives directly to the board of directors." Should I mention that this is coming from you specifically? Rachel asked. No, I said, smiling for the first time in weeks. Let him think it's coming from David Richardson. Jeremy believes he's earned this opportunity through his impressive work and his special relationship with senior leadership. Let's allow him to maintain that belief for a few more weeks. That evening, I received a text in our family group chat that made me laugh out loud. Jeremy had posted a screenshot of his calendar showing Board of Directors presentation, Renewable Energy Strategic Analysis, scheduled for July 15th, along with a message that read, "Dreams do come true when you work hard and prove yourself to the right people." The responses from our family were predictably enthusiastic. Mom posted 3 heart eye emojis and the comment, "So proud of my successful son." Dad wrote, "Knew you had it in you, champ." Patricia added, "Can't wait to hear how it goes. You're going to kill it." I stared at their messages, these people who had spent months celebrating Jeremy's proximity to power while dismissing my actual possession of it, and felt something shift inside me. Not anger anymore, but anticipation. For the first time since this whole situation began, I wasn't reacting to Jeremy's assumptions about his success. I was actively shaping the circumstances that would reveal the truth. Jeremy had been telling everyone about his important relationship with the chairman, his influence on company strategy, his special access to executive decision-making. In 3 weeks, he would walk into a boardroom where he would have the opportunity to demonstrate all of those claims directly to the person he'd been pretending to know. The person he'd publicly humiliated 6 months earlier, the person his family had written off as unsuccessful, the person who had been quietly building the empire he was now pretending to influence. Me. I had become, without realizing it, the mysterious helper in my own story. Not by rescuing Jeremy from his misconceptions, but by giving him exactly what he thought he wanted, the chance to prove his importance to the people who mattered most. Sometimes the best way to help someone see the truth is to give them exactly what they think they deserve. July 15th arrived with the kind of crisp morning clarity that makes everything seem more vivid, more consequential. I had barely slept the night before, not from nervousness. I'd presented to countless boards over the years, but from the surreal anticipation of watching my brother discover that his fictional relationship with the chairman was about to become devastatingly real. I arrived at the Thornfield Industries headquarters 45 minutes before the meeting, taking the private elevator to the 43rd floor boardroom where our quarterly reviews were held. The space was exactly as intimidating as it was meant to be, floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the Riverdale Financial District, a mahogany conference table that could seat 24 people, and original oil paintings that cost more than most people's houses. Rachel had prepared Jeremy's presentation materials and placed them at the far end of the table, directly across from where I would be sitting. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. For 30 minutes, Jeremy and I would be facing each other across the physical and metaphorical distance between his assumptions and my reality. The other board members began arriving at 9:30. Margaret Chen, our chief financial officer, who'd been instrumental in the Meridian Holdings acquisition. Robert Sterling, head of international operations, who'd overseen the Singapore expansion Jeremy was so excited to be peripherally involved in. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, our chief technology officer, who developed the sustainable energy protocols Jeremy would be presenting as if they were insights he'd contributed to, rather than policies she'd created years before his arrival. Each of them was aware of the situation's unique dynamics. Not the personal family drama. I'd never shared details about Jeremy's dismissive treatment of my career, but the professional irony of having an employee present strategic analysis to the executive who'd originated those strategies. They'd agreed to treat Jeremy with the professional courtesy any presenting employee deserved, while allowing the natural consequences of his misconceptions to unfold. At 9:45, David Richardson arrived with Jeremy in tow, and I felt my breath catch slightly as I saw my brother for the first time in a professional context. He looked exactly like someone who'd convinced himself he belonged at the highest levels of corporate leadership. Perfectly tailored navy suit, Italian leather briefcase, confident stride, and an expression of focused intensity that suggested he was about to deliver the presentation of his career. Jeremy's eyes swept the boardroom, taking in the grandeur and obviously calculating the importance of the people he was about to address. When his gaze reached me, sitting at the head of the table in the chairman's seat, there was a moment of confusion. A flicker of recognition followed immediately by dismissal. He saw his sister Cassandra, the underachieving consultant, somehow present at what was clearly a high-level corporate meeting, and his mind simply couldn't process the incongruity. "Good morning, everyone," David said, his voice carrying just a hint of the tension he was feeling. "I'd like to introduce Jeremy Whitmore, our Senior Vice President of Corporate Development, who'll be presenting his analysis of our renewable energy strategic initiatives." Jeremy stepped forward with a confidence that would have been admirable if it hadn't been based on complete misunderstanding of the situation. "Thank you, David. And thank you to the board for this opportunity to share my insights on what I believe could be transformational approaches to sustainable technology integration." He clicked his presentation remote, and the first slide appeared on the large screen. Renewable Energy Strategic Vision, a Path Forward for Thornfield Industries. The subtitle read, "Presented by Jeremy Whitmore, Senior Vice President Corporate Development." What followed was 30 minutes of the most surreal experience of my professional life. Jeremy presented my strategic vision, using my research, explaining my policies, and describing my long-term planning as if they were concepts he'd developed through his sophisticated understanding of global markets and environmental sustainability. "The chairman has been very focused on ESG compliance," he said, clicking to a slide that showed emissions reduction targets I'd personally set 18 months earlier. "Through my analysis, I've identified key areas where we can accelerate implementation while maintaining profitability margins." Margaret Chen glanced at me with barely concealed amusement as Jeremy explained carbon offset strategies that she and I had developed together 2 years before he'd ever heard of Thornfield Industries. Robert Sterling maintained professional composure as Jeremy described international regulatory challenges that Robert had briefed me on just last month. But the most extraordinary moment came when Jeremy reached the section about Southeast Asian expansion opportunities. He clicked to a map showing potential manufacturing sites in Singapore, Malaysia, and Vietnam, and began explaining market analysis that I recognized word for word from a report I'd commissioned 6 months earlier. Based on my research and discussions with senior leadership, Jeremy said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who believed he was revealing insider knowledge, "I believe the chairman's vision for this region could position us as the dominant player in renewable infrastructure development." The chairman's vision. Jeremy was presenting my strategic planning to me while crediting me with having the vision to develop strategies I'd actually created. The recursive absurdity of it was so complete that I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. Margaret Chen leaned forward slightly. "Jeremy, these are very comprehensive insights. Can you tell us more about your discussions with the chairman? Specifically, how closely have you worked together on developing these recommendations?" Jeremy's confidence visibly increased at what he interpreted as validation of his access to senior leadership. "The chairman has been very generous with her time," he said, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "We've had extensive conversations about strategic priorities, and she's made it clear that she values input from team members who demonstrate sophisticated understanding of complex market dynamics." Extensive conversations with me about strategies I'd developed without his input, presented at meetings he'd never attended, implemented through decisions he'd never influenced. Dr. Harper asked the question I'd been waiting for. "Jeremy, I'm curious about the technical specifications you've outlined for the solar integration protocols. These seem very advanced, very specific. Did you develop these parameters yourself, or were they provided to you by the chairman's office?" Jeremy's pause was almost imperceptible, but I caught it. For just a moment, his confidence flickered as he realized he was being asked to demonstrate knowledge rather than simply present information. The technical specifications were developed through collaborative analysis, he said carefully, working closely with the chairman's strategic planning team to ensure alignment with her overall vision for sustainable technology implementation. The chairman's strategic planning team, me. Jeremy was describing his fictional collaboration with me to a room full of people who knew that I was the chairman, that I was the strategic planning team, and that every insight he was presenting had originated from my office without his involvement. Robert Sterling made the observation that brought everything into sharp focus. Jeremy, you've mentioned the chairman's vision and priorities several times. Given how closely you've apparently worked together, I'm sure our chairman would be very interested in your presentation today. Jeremy's face lit up with genuine pleasure. I hope so. I have tremendous respect for her leadership approach, and I'd be honored to receive her feedback on this analysis. Well, Robert said, his voice carrying just a hint of something Jeremy couldn't quite identify, I think you're about to get that opportunity. Jeremy looked confused. I'm sorry? Margaret Chen smiled with the kind of professional warmth that carries an undercurrent of profound irony. Jeremy, I'd like you to meet Cassandra Whitmore, chairman of the board of Thornfield Industries. The silence that followed was so complete, it seemed to have physical weight. Jeremy's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, disbelief, and finally a dawning horror as the magnitude of his situation became clear. His sister, the underachieving consultant, the family disappointment whose career wasn't worth discussing at dinner parties. The woman he'd publicly dismissed as a failure who couldn't understand sophisticated business concepts. She was the chairman. She was the person he'd been pretending to know. She was the strategic visionary whose insights he'd just presented as his own analytical breakthroughs. And she had been sitting there for 30 minutes, listening to him describe their fictional professional relationship while presenting her actual work as evidence of his capabilities. Jeremy's presentation remote slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the mahogany table, the sound impossibly loud in the absolute silence of the boardroom. Hello, Jeremy, I said quietly, my voice steady and professional. That was a very interesting presentation of my strategic planning documents. Perhaps we should discuss your role in their development. The silence in the boardroom stretched for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 15 seconds. I watched Jeremy's face cycle through expressions of disbelief, recognition, and dawning comprehension, as the full magnitude of his situation settled over him like a collapsing building. His mouth opened and closed twice before any sound emerged. Cassie, he whispered, using my childhood nickname in a professional setting where everyone knew me as Ms. Whitmore or Cassandra. The informality of it seemed to amplify the awkwardness of the moment. I prefer Cassandra in professional settings, I said calmly, my voice carrying the same tone I used in every board meeting. Or Ms. Whitmore, if you're more comfortable with formal address. Margaret Chen cleared her throat diplomatically. Perhaps we should take a brief recess to allow everyone to process this introduction. Actually, I said, keeping my eyes on Jeremy's stricken face, I think we should continue with the presentation Q&A. Jeremy was just explaining his extensive collaborative work with the chairman's office on these strategic initiatives. I'm very interested to hear more details about that collaboration. Jeremy looked like he might be sick. Beads of sweat had appeared on his forehead despite the boardroom's carefully controlled temperature, and his usually perfect posture had crumpled into something that resembled a man trying to make himself smaller. There seems to be some confusion, he stammered, reaching for his water glass with trembling hands. I didn't realize. I wasn't told that. That what, Jeremy? I asked, genuinely curious about how he planned to explain the situation. You aren't told that I work here. You weren't informed that the chairman whose vision you've been presenting is your sister. Dr. Harper leaned forward with professional interest. Jeremy, when you mentioned your extensive conversations with the chairman about strategic priorities, Were those perhaps theoretical discussions? Family dinner conversations, maybe? The question offered Jeremy a lifeline, a way to reframe his misrepresentation as innocent family talk rather than deliberate professional deception. But Jeremy's panic seemed to have short-circuited his ability to think strategically. "We've never discussed work," he said quickly, then immediately realized how that statement undermined everything he'd just presented. "I mean, we don't really. Cassandra doesn't usually what?" Robert Sterling asked with polite curiosity. "She doesn't talk about her job," Jeremy finished miserably. "I didn't know I thought she was just a consultant or something." The phrase hung in the air with devastating clarity. Just a consultant or something. Jeremy had just revealed to my entire board of directors that he'd been so dismissive of my career that he'd never bothered to learn what I actually did for a living, despite working for my company and claiming intimate knowledge of my strategic thinking. Margaret Chen's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. She'd worked with me for 4 years, had seen me navigate complex international negotiations, had witnessed my strategic decision-making under pressure. Hearing my own brother describe my career as just consulting or something clearly struck her as both personally offensive and professionally mystifying. "Jeremy?" I said, deciding to take control of the situation before it became completely unmanageable. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately. Board members, could you give us 15 minutes? Jeremy and I need to clarify some things about his role here at Meridian Holdings." As the other executives filed out of the boardroom with professionally neutral expressions that barely concealed their fascination with the unfolding family drama, Jeremy and I were left alone for the first time in a professional context. The silence was different now, heavier, more personal, charged with months of accumulated misunderstanding and dismissal. "Cassie," Jeremy began, then caught himself. "Cassandra, I had no idea. You never told me you worked for Thornfield Industries." "I never told you because you never asked," I replied, standing up from my seat and walking to the windows overlooking the financial district. "In 3 years since I started working here, you've never once inquired about the specifics of my job, my responsibilities, or my career trajectory." "But how was I supposed to know you were he struggled with the words, "the chairman? I mean, you're so young, and you never acted like someone who ran a multi-billion-dollar company." I turned to face him. "How exactly does someone who runs a multi-billion-dollar company act, Jeremy? Do they brag about their achievements at family dinners? Do they demand recognition and praise for their professional accomplishments? Do they use their position to belittle family members who haven't reached their level of success?" Each question hit its mark. Jeremy's face flushed as he recognized his own behavior reflected back at him. I never meant to." He stopped, perhaps realizing that his intentions were irrelevant compared to the impact of his actions. "How long have you been chairman?" 3 years. I was the youngest chairman in Thornfield's history when I was appointed at 29. 3 years, he repeated. "You've been chairman for 3 years, and I've been mocking my dead-end job? Offering to help me find something more appropriate to my abilities? Suggesting I wasn't cut out for high-stakes corporate decision-making?" I finished for him. "Yes, Jeremy, for 3 years." He buried his face in his hands. "Oh God, the anniversary party, what I said in front of everyone. About me being a glorified secretary who wasted her Stanford MBA? Yes, I remember that speech quite clearly. And I just presented your strategic plans to you as if they were my own analysis." His voice was muffled by his hands. "I told you about your own policies as if I'd developed them. I described your vision as if I'd helped create it. You did. And you did it with tremendous confidence, I might add. Very convincing presentation of my work." Jeremy looked up at me with something approaching desperation. "What happens now? I mean, professionally. Are you going to fire me?" The question surprised me with its directness. I had expected more deflection, more attempts to minimize his behavior or blame external circumstances. Instead, Jeremy seemed to be grasping, perhaps for the first time, the full professional consequences of his actions. "That depends," I said, returning to my seat at the head of the table. "Are you going to continue claiming credit for strategic initiatives you didn't develop? Are you going to keep telling clients and colleagues about your special relationship with senior leadership? Are you going to maintain this fiction that you have influence on corporate decision-making that you don't actually possess?" "No," he said quickly. "No, of course not. I'll clarify the situation with anyone I might have misled." Misled is a gentle way to describe it, but I appreciate the commitment to accuracy going forward. I leaned back in my chair, studying my brother's stricken face. "Jeremy, you're actually quite good at your job when you're focused on your actual responsibilities, rather than pretending to have responsibilities you don't possess. David Richardson has noted your analytical skills and your client relationship management. You could have a successful career at Meridian Holdings if you can manage to stay in your lane." Relief flooded his features. "You're not going to fire me?" "I'm going to give you a choice," I said. "You can continue working at Meridian Holdings under two conditions. First, you will never again misrepresent your role, your access, or your influence within this company. Second, you will treat all senior leadership, including me, with the same professional respect you would show any executive, regardless of our family relationship." Jeremy nodded eagerly. "Yes, absolutely, I can do that." "Or," I continued, "you can request a transfer to one of our other subsidiaries, where the family dynamic won't be a professional complication. I'll ensure you receive a position commensurate with your skills and experience." I'd like to stay at Meridian Holdings if that's possible. I know I've made mistakes, but I want to earn my place here legitimately. I studied him for a moment, looking for signs of genuine understanding versus convenient promises made under pressure. What I saw was something I hadn't expected: humility. For the first time in months, Jeremy looked like he understood that his assumptions had been wrong, his behavior had been problematic, and his success would need to be earned rather than assumed. "All right," I said finally. "But Jeremy, this conversation changes nothing about our family relationship. I'm still your sister, you're still my brother, and we still need to address what's happened between us personally. This professional resolution doesn't erase the personal damage." He nodded, looking more serious than I'd seen him since childhood. "I know. And Cassandra, I'm sorry. Not just about the work stuff, but about everything. The way I've treated you, the things I've said, the assumptions I made. I was completely wrong about everything." It wasn't enough. Not nearly enough to undo months of dismissal and humiliation, but it was a beginning. And for the first time since this whole situation started, I felt like I was in control of how it would unfold. The board members returned to the conference room with the carefully neutral expressions of seasoned executives who had witnessed something unprecedented but were too professional to show their fascination. Jeremy had used our 15-minute break to compose himself, straightening his tie and attempting to restore some semblance of professional dignity, though the shell-shocked look in his eyes remained unmistakable. Before we conclude today's meeting, I announced as everyone settled back into their seats, "I think it's important to address what just transpired here. Jeremy has acknowledged that he misrepresented his role and access within our organization, and we've discussed how to move forward professionally." Margaret Chen leaned forward slightly. "Cassandra, should we be concerned about other instances where employees might be overstating their authority or misrepresenting their relationships with senior leadership?" It was exactly the question I'd been hoping someone would ask. "Actually, Margaret, that raises an interesting point. David, when you first called me about Jeremy's behavior, you mentioned this wasn't an isolated incident. Can you elaborate on that for the board?" David Richardson shifted uncomfortably, clearly not expecting to be put on the spot, but his loyalty to accurate reporting overrode his personal discomfort. "Over the past month, we've had several situations where employees have made claims about access or influence that didn't align with actual reporting structures. Jeremy's case was the most pronounced, but there have been others." Dr. Harper frowned. Are we talking about a systemic issue with our internal communications? Or is this more about individual employees who are unclear about organizational hierarchy? Both, potentially, David admitted. Some of our middle management has been making promises to clients based on assumed rather than actual authority. And there seems to be some confusion about how decision-making flows from the board level down through subsidiaries. Robert Sterling made a note on his tablet. This could become a liability issue if employees are making commitments we can't honor or misrepresenting our capabilities to external partners. I nodded thoughtfully, though I'd already spent considerable time analyzing this exact problem. David, I want you to conduct a comprehensive audit of all client communications from Meridian Holdings over the past 6 months. Identify any instances where employees have overstated their authority or made promises beyond their scope of responsibility. Jeremy's face went pale. He was clearly realizing that his misrepresentations weren't just personal embarrassments. They were part of a pattern of behavior that could have serious business consequences. Furthermore, continued, I want detailed reports on any external meetings where Meridian employees have claimed special access to board-level decision-making. If we have a culture that encourages this kind of misrepresentation, we need to understand its scope and address it systematically. Margaret Chen pulled up something on her laptop. Cassandra, I'm looking at our quarterly client satisfaction surveys, and there's an interesting pattern. Several clients have mentioned being impressed by our employees. Apparent closeness to executive leadership. I initially interpreted that as positive feedback about our accessibility, but now I'm wondering if it reflects this misrepresentation issue. Exactly, I said. We may have inadvertently created a culture where employees feel pressure to oversell their influence, rather than demonstrate competence through actual performance. Dr. Harper raised another concern. There's also the question of how this affects team dynamics internally. If some employees are claiming special relationships with senior leadership, it undermines the authority of legitimate supervisors and creates false hierarchies. David nodded grimly. We've definitely seen some of that. Other VPs have asked me privately whether certain employees have family connections or special arrangements that would explain their confidence about accessing executive decision-makers. The irony wasn't lost on me. Jeremy's colleagues had been wondering if he had family connections that explained his behavior, and they'd been absolutely correct, just not in the way they'd imagined. Here's what we're going to do, I announced, shifting into the strategic planning mode that had made me successful in corporate leadership. First, we're implementing mandatory training on organizational authority and client communication protocols. Every employee at director level and above will complete certification on what they can and cannot promise to external partners. Jeremy was taking notes frantically, perhaps hoping that active participation might somehow mitigate his embarrassment. Second, I continued, we're creating a formal escalation process for any commitments that exceed an employee's documented authority. If someone wants to promise a client access to board-level decision-making, that request goes through proper channels with proper approval. Robert Sterling looked up from his tablet. That's going to slow down some client relationship development, but it's necessary for accuracy and liability protection. Third, I said, looking directly at Jeremy, we're instituting a policy of transparent accountability. Any employee who misrepresents their role or authority will face disciplinary action proportionate to the severity and impact of their misrepresentation. The message was clear. Jeremy's situation wasn't going to be handled quietly or swept under the rug. His behavior was being treated as part of a larger organizational issue that required systemic solutions and clear consequences. Margaret Chen raised her hand slightly. Cassandra, what about external communication? Should we be proactively reaching out to clients who might have received inaccurate information about employee authority levels? Yes, I said without hesitation. David, I want you to identify any client relationships that might have been affected by these misrepresentations and schedule meetings to clarify our actual organizational structure and capabilities. Jeremy looked like he might faint. The prospect of having his exaggerated claims systematically corrected with every client he'd impressed was clearly more mortifying than he'd anticipated. However, I added, showing a mercy that surprised even me, we'll frame these conversations as organizational clarity rather than correcting individual employee mistakes. Our clients don't need to know about specific personnel issues. They just need accurate information about how we operate. Dr. Harper smiled approvingly. That protects both the company's reputation and individual employees while ensuring everyone has correct information going forward. Exactly. And Jeremy, I said, addressing him directly for the first time since the board members had returned, you'll be participating in all of these client clarification meetings. You'll have the opportunity to demonstrate your actual expertise while ensuring accurate expectations about your role and authority. It was a perfect consequence. Jeremy would have to personally correct every exaggerated claim he'd made, but in a way that allowed him to rebuild client relationships based on his legitimate skills rather than fictional influence. I understand, Jeremy said quietly, and I want to say, for the record, that I take full responsibility for my misrepresentations. I let my enthusiasm about working for such an impressive organization cloud my judgment about appropriate professional boundaries. Margaret Chen nodded approvingly at Jeremy's statement, clearly impressed by his willingness to accept accountability rather than make excuses. Finally, I announced I'm establishing a quarterly review process where subsidiary CEOs will report directly to the board about any concerns regarding employee representation of their authority or access. We're not just addressing this reactively, we're building systems to prevent it proactively. Robert Sterling closed his laptop with satisfaction. This turns what could have been an embarrassing personnel issue into a comprehensive improvement of our operational integrity. Very well handled. As the meeting concluded and board members began gathering their materials, I realized that Jeremy's misconduct had actually provided me with an opportunity to address systemic issues I'd been concerned about for months. His personal embarrassment had become a catalyst for organizational improvements that would benefit every subsidiary and protect us from future liability. Jeremy lingered after the others had left, clearly wanting to discuss the personal implications of what had just transpired, but I wasn't ready for that conversation yet. The professional consequences had been addressed with appropriate corporate solutions. The personal reckoning would require a different setting and a different kind of accountability. Jeremy, I said as I packed up my presentation materials, I'll see you at the client clarification meetings David schedules. And I expect you to review the organizational authority training materials before our next interaction. He nodded, understanding that our sibling relationship would remain separate from our professional obligations until I decided otherwise. As I left the boardroom, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: complete professional satisfaction. Not just from resolving Jeremy's immediate behavior problems, but from transforming his personal misconduct into systematic organizational improvements. Sometimes justice isn't about punishment. It's about using the truth to create better systems for everyone. 3 days after the board meeting, my phone rang at 11:30 p.m. Jeremy's name appeared on the screen and something in my chest tightened. Late-night calls from family members usually meant crisis, and given everything that had happened, I wasn't sure I was prepared for whatever emotional emergency he might be facing. Cassandra? His voice was rough, strained, like he'd been crying or shouting or both. I know it's late, but I need to talk to you. Not about work, about everything else. About what I've done to you, to our family, to God, to everything. I sat up in bed, immediately alert. Jeremy, are you okay? Where are you? I'm sitting in my car outside Mom and Dad's house, he said. I drove down here to tell them what happened at the board meeting. And I can't go inside. I can't face them knowing what I know now. Through my bedroom window, I could see the lights of downtown Riverdale stretching toward the harbor. Jeremy was 45 minutes away in Millbrook Heights, having some kind of breakdown in our parents' driveway. The image was both pathetic and heartbreaking. What exactly are you afraid to tell them? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Everything. The word came out as almost a sob. That I've been working for my sister's company. That the chairman I've been bragging about knowing is the daughter they think is a failure. That every achievement I've celebrated with them is built on your actual success, while I've been treating you like you're worthless. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of months of accumulated hurt settle over me like a familiar blanket. Jeremy, you need to come inside. You can't sit in their driveway all night having an emotional crisis. But how do I explain this to them? How do I walk into that house and admit that everything they've been proud of me for is actually a reflection of your accomplishments? That the daughter they've been embarrassed by is the one who's actually successful? The pain in his voice was genuine, but it was also infuriating. Even in his moment of accountability, Jeremy was still making this about himself, his embarrassment, his difficulty explaining, his emotional crisis. The impact on me, the months of dismissal and humiliation I'd endured, seemed secondary to his current discomfort with the truth. Jeremy, I said, my voice sharper than I'd intended, I need you to listen to me very carefully. This conversation isn't about you managing your embarrassment or figuring out how to save face with our parents. This is about you finally acknowledging the damage you've done and taking responsibility for it. I know, he said quickly. I do know that. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make it about me. I don't know how to fix this. You can't fix it, I said bluntly. You can't undo months of public humiliation, family dismissal, and systematic erosion of my place in our family structure. What you can do is stop making it worse. The silence on the other end of the phone stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. Tell me what I did, he said finally. I mean, I know what I did generally, but I need to hear it from you. I need to understand the full scope of how badly I've hurt you. It was the first time Jeremy had asked me to explain my experience, rather than defending his intentions, and something about the request caught me off guard. I'd been carrying this hurt for so long that I'd almost forgotten anyone might actually want to understand it. You publicly humiliated me at Mom and Dad's anniversary party, I began, surprised by how raw the memory still felt. In front of 60 people, you called me a glorified secretary who'd wasted my education. You implied that I was an embarrassment to the family name. God, Jeremy whispered, I remember that. I thought I was being motivational, like I was challenging you to do better. You were being cruel, I corrected. And you were making assumptions about my career without ever bothering to ask me what I actually did for a living. I should have asked, he admitted. I should have been interested in your work, your life, your achievements. Instead, I just assumed that if you weren't talking about success, you weren't experiencing it. Then, when you got the position at Meridian Holdings, it got worse, I continued. Every family gathering became a celebration of your corporate ascension, with casual dismissals of my career thrown in as contrast. You offered to help me find something more appropriate to my abilities. You suggested I wasn't cut out for high-stakes decision-making. While you were literally making decisions about my career, Jeremy said, the irony clearly hitting him fresh. Jesus, Cassandra, I was condescending to the person who controls my professional future. It wasn't about professional control, I said. It was about basic human respect. You treated me like I was too simple to understand sophisticated concepts, while I was developing the strategies you were so excited to be peripherally involved in. The client meetings, Jeremy said, his voice hollow. All those times I called to brag about sitting in on discussions about mergers and acquisitions, about strategic planning sessions, about international expansion opportunities. You were describing my work to me, I finished. You were explaining my business decisions as if they were insights you were gaining from proximity to important people. You never realized that I was the important people. Jeremy made a sound that might have been laughter or crying. How did you stand it? How did you sit there listening to me be so completely wrong about everything without correcting me? Because I kept hoping you'd eventually ask, I said honestly. I kept thinking that maybe if I just waited, you'd get curious about my actual life, instead of being satisfied with your assumptions about my failure. But I never asked. No, you never did. Even when I gave you opportunities, when I hinted that my work was more complex than you understood, you weren't interested in learning more. You were content believing that your little sister was just getting by while you achieved real success. The silence returned, heavier this time, weighted with Jeremy's growing understanding of the systematic nature of his dismissiveness. "What about Mom and Dad?" he asked finally. "How much did they participate in this?" "They followed your lead," I said. "They've always looked to you for cues about success and achievement. When you decided I wasn't worth celebrating, they stopped celebrating me. When you implied my career didn't matter, they stopped asking about it. So I didn't just hurt you, I influenced them to hurt you too." Yes. Jeremy was quiet for a long time, processing the full scope of his impact on family dynamics that had developed over months of his influence. "I want to tell them tonight," he said finally. "I want to go inside and explain everything, who you really are, what you've actually achieved, how wrong I've been about everything." "No," I said immediately. "Jeremy, you don't get to control how and when they learn the truth. You've managed the family narrative for months without my input. You don't get to manage the correction without my permission. Then what do I do? How do I begin to make this right?" "You start by going home," I said. "You start by sitting with the discomfort of knowing how badly you've misjudged everything. You start by understanding that making this right isn't about one conversation or one grand gesture. It's about fundamentally changing how you see me, how you treat me, and how you influence others to see me." "Will you give me the chance to try?" he asked. "I know I don't deserve it, but will you let me prove that I can do better?" I looked out at the city lights, thinking about forgiveness and justice and the difference between someone being sorry and someone being changed. "Jeremy," I said finally, "I'll give you the chance to show me who you are when you actually understand who I am. But that starts with you figuring out how to be my brother without needing to be superior to me." After we hung up, I sat in my darkened bedroom for a long time, thinking about the conversation and what it might mean for our family's future. Jeremy seemed genuinely horrified by his behavior, but horror wasn't the same as transformation. Understanding the damage wasn't the same as developing the capacity to avoid causing it again. The real test wouldn't be his remorse. It would be his ability to rebuild our relationship on the foundation of truth rather than assumption, respect rather than condescension, curiosity rather than dismissal. But for the first time in months, I felt like that test might actually be worth taking. The family dinner invitation arrived exactly 1 week after Jeremy's midnight phone call, delivered not through our usual group text, but as a formal email from my mother's personal account. The subject line read, "Sunday dinner important family discussion," and the message itself was uncharacteristically brief. "Cassandra, please join us this Sunday at 4 p.m. Jeremy has shared some information that requires family conversation. Love, Mom." I stared at the email for several minutes, trying to decode its careful formality. Mom's usual dinner invitations were casual, chatty affairs filled with menu descriptions and updates about neighborhood gossip. This read like a diplomatic summons, suggesting that Jeremy had indeed told them something, though clearly not everything. Sunday afternoon brought the kind of perfect New England weather that makes family obligations feel less burdensome. Clear skies, comfortable temperature, the kind of light that makes even difficult conversations seem manageable. I drove to Millbrook Heights with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, wondering what version of the truth Jeremy had shared and how our parents had processed it. The first sign that something fundamental had shifted came when I pulled into the driveway. Dad was waiting on the front porch, something he'd never done before. He stood as my car approached, his posture carrying an unfamiliar uncertainty that immediately put me on alert. "Cassandra," he said as I walked up the stone pathway, using my full name instead of the casual Cass that had been his default for 32 years. "Thank you for coming. I know this must feel complicated for you." The acknowledgement that my experience might be complicated was so unlike my father's usual assumptions about family dynamics that I almost stumbled on the front steps. Inside, the scene was equally surreal. Mom was setting the dining room table with her good china, the spode pattern she usually reserved for major holidays, while Jeremy sat in the living room looking like he was awaiting execution. The formal table setting and Jeremy's obvious dread created an atmosphere of ceremonial importance that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Honey," Mom said, appearing in the doorway with a nervous smile, "you look wonderful. I love that dress on you. Very professional." Professional. The word hung in the air with newfound meaning. Mom had never described my clothing as professional before, probably because she'd never thought of me as having a profession worth dressing for. Patricia was noticeably absent, though her usual Sunday visit had been canceled, according to a text I'd received that morning. "Family emergency," she'd written. "Can we catch up next week instead?" Apparently, whatever Jeremy had told our parents was significant enough to alter Patricia's schedule. We gathered around the dining room table with an awkwardness that felt like the emotional equivalent of a formal business meeting. Dad cleared his throat twice before speaking, clearly having rehearsed whatever he was about to say. "Cassandra, Jeremy has told us about what happened at his board meeting," he began, his voice carrying a weight I'd never heard before. "He's explained about your position at Thornfield Industries." Your position. Not your job or your work, but your position, as if the word itself required careful handling. "He has?" I said carefully, glancing at Jeremy, who was staring at his plate with the intensity of someone trying to memorize the pattern. Mom leaned forward slightly. "Sweetheart, why didn't you tell us you were the chairman? I mean, we had no idea you were so—" She trailed off, apparently struggling with vocabulary. "So what, Mom?" "So important," she finished quietly. "So successful, so accomplished." The admission landed with unexpected impact. Important, successful, accomplished. These were words my parents had never applied to my career, words I'd heard them use countless times to describe Jeremy's achievements, but never my own. Jeremy finally looked up from his plate. "I told them everything," he said, his voice rough around the edges. "About the board meeting, about how I didn't know who you were, about all the things I said about your career over the years." "Everything?" I asked. "Everything," he confirmed. "The anniversary party speech. The condescending offers to help you find better work. The way I treated your achievements like they didn't matter because I didn't understand what they were." Dad shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Jeremy also helped us understand that your mother and I haven't been as supportive as we should have been, that we made assumptions about your career without asking the right questions." It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever heard from my father, though it was carefully constructed to avoid direct admission of wrongdoing. "Made assumptions rather than dismissed your success. Haven't been as supportive as we should have been, rather than ignored your achievements while celebrating Jeremy's." Mom reached across the table and touched my hand tentatively. "Cassandra, I need you to know that we've always been proud of you. Maybe we didn't show it the way we should have, but we never thought you were unsuccessful." "Mom," I said gently, 6 months ago at your birthday dinner, you said you'd finally be able to hold your head up at the country club when people asked what your children did for a living. The implication was pretty clear." She flushed deeply, the color rising from her neck to her cheeks. That wasn't what I meant. I meant that Jeremy's success would add to our family's reputation, not that yours didn't already." She stopped, clearly realizing that her explanation was making things worse rather than better. Jeremy intervened before the awkwardness could escalate further. "Mom, Dad, we need to be honest about this. I influenced how you saw Cassandra's career. I set the tone for how our family discussed her work, and that tone was dismissive and condescending." The direct acknowledgement surprised me. Jeremy was taking responsibility not just for his own behavior, but for his influence on our parents' attitudes. But more than that, he continued, I need to apologize to Cassandra directly, in front of both of you, for how I've treated her. He turned to face me fully. Cassandra, I'm sorry for dismissing your career without understanding it. I'm sorry for making assumptions about your success based on your personality rather than your achievements. I'm sorry for using your perceived failure to highlight my perceived success. The apology was more comprehensive than I'd expected, though I noticed he was still framing my career in terms of perception rather than reality. Jeremy, I said, I appreciate the apology, but I need you to understand something. My success isn't perceived, it's actual. My achievements aren't hidden or modest. They're substantial and documented. The problem wasn't that I was unsuccessful and you didn't realize it. The problem was that I was highly successful and you couldn't see it. Dad leaned forward with genuine curiosity. Cassandra, can you help us understand what we missed? I mean, we know you're chairman now, but how did we not know? How did we not see? You didn't see because you didn't look, I said simply. For 3 years, I've been running a multi-billion-dollar company, making decisions that affect thousands of employees, traveling internationally for business negotiations. But because I didn't talk about it at family dinners, you assumed it wasn't happening. Mom looked genuinely confused. But why didn't you talk about it? If you were accomplishing so much, why didn't you share it with us? It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself since this whole situation began. Because, I said slowly, I learned early in my career that the most powerful people often operate quietly. I valued discretion over recognition. I chose substance over publicity. And honestly, I was proud of being successful without needing constant validation. But we're your family, Mom protested. We wanted to celebrate your achievements. Did you? I asked. Because when Jeremy got his position at Meridian Holdings, a company I own, you threw celebration after celebration. When I got promoted to chairman 3 years ago, I mentioned it briefly at Sunday dinner, and Dad changed the subject to Jeremy's latest case. The silence that followed was profound. Dad's face showed genuine shock, as if he was accessing a memory and seeing it clearly for the first time. You mentioned being promoted to chairman, he asked quietly. I said I'd been appointed to a new position with more responsibilities. You asked if it meant longer hours. And when I said yes, you said that hopefully Jeremy would be more available for family events, since his career was really taking off. The memory was clearly painful for Dad to confront. I don't remember it that way, he said weakly. I do, I said simply. Because it was the moment I realized that my achievements would never matter to this family the way Jeremy's did. Jeremy spoke into the uncomfortable silence. That needs to change, he said firmly. All of it. The way we celebrate each other, the way we listen to each other, the assumptions we make about success and worth. It was the most mature thing I'd heard Jeremy say in years, and something in my chest loosened slightly. I want to change, Mom said, her voice carrying a tremor of emotion. I want to learn about your work, your achievements, your life. I want to understand who you really are instead of who I assumed you were. Dad nodded agreement. We missed so much, Cassandra. Not just about your career, but about you as a person. Your intelligence, your capabilities, your strength. The conversation continued for another 2 hours, covering territory that felt both familiar and completely new. My parents asked questions about my work that they'd never thought to ask before. Jeremy shared details about his experience at Meridian Holdings that highlighted my leadership rather than his proximity to it. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was recognition. It was the beginning of a family dynamic based on actual understanding rather than comfortable assumptions. And for the first time in months, I felt like I was sitting at my own family's table as myself, rather than as the person they decided I was. 6 months later, I stood in front of the mirror in my penthouse apartment, adjusting the jacket of a navy blue suit that cost more than Jeremy's first car. Today wasn't just any board meeting. It was the quarterly presentation where Jeremy would deliver his legitimate analysis of Meridian Holdings, renewable energy expansion, based entirely on his actual work and documented expertise rather than fictional relationships with executive leadership. The transformation in our family dynamics over the past half-year had been remarkable, though not without its complications. Jeremy had thrown himself into his work with the desperate intensity of someone trying to prove he deserved his position through merit rather than assumption. His quarterly reports had become models of thorough research and careful analysis, earning genuine praise from colleagues who no longer wondered about his mysterious connections to senior leadership. More importantly, he'd stopped talking about work at family gatherings entirely. The shift had been jarring at first. Sunday dinners without Jeremy holding court about his corporate insights felt strangely empty, but gradually, our conversations had found new rhythms. We talked about books, travel, Mom's garden, Dad's volunteer work, Patricia's children. Normal family topics that didn't require anyone to perform success for the others. Benefit. My phone chimed with a text from Jeremy. "Presentation ready. See you in the boardroom. Thanks for giving me the chance to earn this legitimately." The message made me smile. Jeremy had developed a habit of thanking me for things that weren't actually gifts, like the opportunity to do his job properly, or the chance to rebuild trust through consistent behavior rather than dramatic gestures. It was part of his ongoing process of recalibrating his understanding of professional relationships and family dynamics. The drive to Thornfield Industries gave me time to reflect on the broader changes that had emerged from what I'd initially seen as purely personal family drama. The organizational improvements we'd implemented after Jeremy's board meeting disaster had become a case study in corporate culture transformation. Other companies were reaching out to learn about our employee accountability protocols and transparent communication structures. I'd been invited to speak at 3 business conferences about building authentic leadership cultures, though I turned down all the invitations. Public speaking about corporate culture felt ironic, given that my own family hadn't understood my corporate culture for years. I preferred to let our results speak for themselves: improved client satisfaction, reduced liability exposure, and significantly better internal communication across all subsidiaries. The elevator ride to the 43rd floor boardroom gave me a moment to consider how different this quarterly meeting felt compared to Jeremy's disastrous presentation 6 months earlier. Today, he would be presenting to executives who knew exactly who he was, what he'd accomplished, and what authority he actually possessed. His success or failure would be based entirely on the quality of his work, rather than the mythology of his access. Margaret Chen was already in the boardroom when I arrived, reviewing financial projections on her tablet. "Cassandra," she said, looking up with the easy familiarity that had developed over our years of working together, "Jeremy's sustainability analysis is actually quite impressive. I think you'll be pleased with how thoroughly he's approached the Southeast Asian market opportunities." The comment struck me as significant. Margaret was praising Jeremy's work to me not because of our family relationship, but despite it. She'd evaluated his presentation on its merits and found it genuinely valuable, something that wouldn't have been possible when his contributions were based on fictional collaboration with the chairman. Other board members filed in over the next few minutes, greeting me with their usual professional warmth. None of them treated the fact that my brother worked for our subsidiary as particularly noteworthy anymore. Jeremy had become just another competent employee whose presentations were worth their attention, rather than the source of awkward family drama that required delicate handling. Jeremy arrived precisely on time, carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd earned his place through documented performance. The nervous energy that had characterized his previous boardroom appearance had been replaced by genuine professional composure. "Good morning, everyone," he said, setting up his presentation materials with practiced efficiency. "I'm here to present our analysis of renewable energy expansion opportunities in Southeast Asia, with particular focus on regulatory frameworks and infrastructure partnerships." What followed was 30 minutes of legitimately impressive strategic analysis. Jeremy had clearly spent months researching market conditions, regulatory requirements, and competitive positioning. His recommendations were thoughtful, well-documented, and demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the challenges involved in international expansion. Most importantly, he never once mentioned special insight from senior leadership, collaborative discussions with the chairman, or any other reference to fictional access that had characterized his previous presentations. His analysis stood on its own merits, supported by data and research rather than imaginary relationships. When he finished, Dr. Harper asked the first question. Jeremy, your analysis of Vietnamese regulatory compliance is particularly thorough. How did you develop expertise in that market? I spent 2 weeks in Ho Chi Minh City last month, Jeremy replied, meeting with local regulatory officials and infrastructure development companies. I also consulted with 3 different legal firms that specialize in Southeast Asian renewable energy projects. The answer was everything his previous presentations hadn't been: specific, factual, and based on his actual work rather than assumed authority. Margaret Chen nodded approvingly and made notes about following up on his Vietnam recommendations. After Jeremy left the boardroom, Robert Sterling made an observation that captured something significant about the transformation we'd all witnessed. It's remarkable how much more impressive someone's work becomes when they're not trying to impress you with how impressive they think they are. The comment resonated beyond Jeremy's individual case. Over the past 6 months, I'd noticed similar improvements across all our subsidiaries, as employees focused on demonstrating competence rather than proximity to power. The organizational culture changes we'd implemented had created space for authentic achievement to flourish. That evening, I received an unexpected phone call from Patricia, who'd maintained careful distance from our family drama while it was unfolding. Cassandra, she said, I wanted to call because I owe you an apology I should have offered months ago. I settled into my living room chair, curious about where this conversation was heading. When Jeremy was going through his revelations about your career, I realized that I'd been just as guilty of dismissing your achievements, she continued. I never asked about your work either. I never showed interest in your professional life. I just assumed that if it were important, you'd be talking about it the way Jeremy talked about his. Patricia's apology surprised me with its directness. I appreciate you saying that, I said. There's more, she continued. I've been thinking about this a lot, and I realized that our whole family had developed this culture where success meant performance. Jeremy performed his achievements, so we celebrated them. You achieved without performing, so we didn't recognize them. The insight was more sophisticated than I'd expected from Patricia, who'd always seemed more focused on her own career than family dynamics. I want to be better, she said. I want to be the kind of family member who asks real questions and shows genuine interest in your actual life, rather than making assumptions based on how much you talk about it. It was the kind of transformation that went beyond individual apologies to systemic change in how our family understood and valued each other. Jeremy's misconduct had forced all of us to examine our assumptions about success, recognition, and the different ways people choose to move through the world. A year later, our family dynamics had settled into something entirely new. Jeremy had been promoted to executive vice president based purely on his documented performance and strategic contributions. Mom had started a book club focused on business biographies and frequently asked thoughtful questions about corporate leadership challenges. Dad had begun volunteering with a nonprofit that helped first-generation college students navigate professional development, drawing on insights from watching his children's very different approaches to career building. Most significantly, our family celebrations had evolved to recognize all kinds of achievements, not just the loud, obvious ones. When I'd been invited to join the board of a major environmental foundation, the family celebration had been as enthusiastic as any of Jeremy's previous corporate milestones. When Jeremy had published a research paper on sustainable energy policy, we'd treated it as the genuine intellectual achievement it was, rather than evidence of his access to important people. The lesson that emerged from our family's transformation was both simple and profound. Success comes in many forms, and the people who achieve quietly are no less accomplished than those who achieve publicly. Sometimes the most powerful people are the ones you'd never suspect, and sometimes the greatest achievements are the ones that don't require an audience. As I finished writing this story, sitting in my home office overlooking the Riverdale Harbor where I'd contemplated so many difficult family dynamics over the past year, I realized that Jeremy's arrogance had inadvertently given me the greatest gift possible, the opportunity to be truly seen by the people I loved most. And if you've made it this far in the story, maybe you've learned something too about looking more carefully at the quiet achievers in your own life. Maybe you've realized that success isn't always loud, power isn't always obvious, and the people you underestimate might be the ones holding all the cards. So tell me in the comments below, who's the quiet achiever in your family that deserves more recognition? And if this story resonated with you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've got another incredible story about family, success, and the surprising ways life teaches us what really matters. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's just living authentically and letting the truth speak for itself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.